All right, we are good.
Okay, wonderful. I see the message up there that the recording has started. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon on this beautiful spring day. Today we are welcoming Joel Burcat to our State Library Lunch and Learn series. And I'd like to introduce Joel to you first here. So, as a practicing environmental lawyer, Joel Burcat writes environmental legal thrillers that are both electrifying and accurate. Burcat's writings explore many facets of life, although he has a true fascination with unexpected twists. His characters' reasons for doing things are as important as their actions. From the person lying in bed next to you to the psychopathic strip mine operators, each has an underlying motive to be explored and revealed. Burcat has completed 5 novels. 3 of them are environmental legal thrillers: Drink to Every Beast, Amid Rage, and Strange Fire, published by Headline Books, and they're available at bookstores, Amazon, Barnes & Noble in paperback, and electronic formats. In addition to his fiction, Joel has edited the 2 preeminent books on environmental and oil and gas law in Pennsylvania, both of which have received international awards. He edited, along with Terry Bossert, 7 editions of Pennsylvania Environmental Law and Practice, PA Bar Institute Press. In 1999, the second edition won the Outstanding Achievement Award in the Best Publication category in the annual contest sponsored by the International Association for Continuing Legal Education. He also edited, along with Stephen Saunders, the first 2 editions of the Law of Oil and Gas in Pennsylvania. In 2015, the first edition won the Award of Outstanding Achievement in Publications in the annual contest sponsored by the International Association for Continuing Legal Education. Burkett grew up in Philadelphia. He has 2 grown daughters, a son-in-law, and 2 grandchildren. He lives with his wife in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the place that provides the setting for many of his stories. And I'd like to start out by asking Joel to read a passage from his book.
Well, thank you very much, Ellen. I appreciate that kind introduction. Let me also say how delighted I am that I learned literally this morning that all 3 of my fiction books are now available at the State Library of Pennsylvania. And that's in addition to my nonfiction books, as well as the book by my cousin on combustion engineering that nobody understands. So it's just, I appreciate that. And that means that makes the books much more accessible. So thank you very much. Thank you to the State Library of Pennsylvania for sponsoring this program. And thanks to you and everyone else who was involved in organizing my presentation today. So thanks to everybody. And I'm happy to start reading from Strange Fire. So let me just jump right in and then we can get into the discussion. So chapter 1 of Strange Fire, A Hunting We Will Go. Bones Benson fumbled the Remington Magnum rifle that his boss, Norby LaFleur, heaved to him like a drill sergeant. We're going hunting. When? Now? Bones looked out the window of their office, located in a work trailer at the Campbell drill pad. At 4:50 a.m., it was still dark, and sunrise wasn't until 6:41 a.m. on this cold April morning in Bradford County, Pennsylvania. Norby didn't respond. Instead, he placed a box of ammo, 7mm rounds, on the work table. Bones loaded the rifle and shoved a handful of bullets into his pocket. He wondered what his boss was up to. Generally, Norby never explained himself. He just gave orders. Norby's Weatherby hunting rifle was already loaded and slung over his shoulder, muzzle pointed down. He looked out the small window, past the glare of the LED security lights, and into the darkness. Bones glanced at the Remington. Boss, what are we hunting? It's a little late for deer, maybe a little early. And last I checked, there were no elk out here. This is some heavy-duty firepower. Norby stared him quiet. He pushed past Bones and clanged down the work trailer's 3 metal steps. The black and gold letters, glinting in the bluish security light, read Yukon ONG Ops. Bones had to jog to keep up with him. Bones noticed the cacophony of bird songs as he struggled to keep up with Norby. They crossed the drill pad and headed straight for the 3 steel production trees located dead center on the pad. The trees controlled the flow of natural gas out of the already drilled wells and connected them to a nearby pipeline. Norby took a small flashlight out of his pocket and flashed it on the steel upper master valve. See? Over here. These are the pockmarks from that sumbitch's shots. Over the previous weeks, Norby had used a black felt tip marker to circle the divots in the steel. He'd written dates next to the dings, 3:30, 4:1, 4:2, in all a half dozen pockmarks in the steel. Looky here. Norby played the light on a shining divot that did not have a circle drawn around it. The gouge looked fresh. And here, another fresh divot, no circle. He did this early this morning before we got here, middle of the night, like the others. Norby looked at his assistant. Corsica, he's out there. He turned his flashlight to the perimeter of the pad. Norby narrowed his eyes, aimed to put him down like the dog he is once and for all. Bones nodded. Maybe this is a job for law enforcement. I mean, if he's shooting at our production facilities, well, maybe it'd be better to have them handle this. Norby glared at him and shook his head. Did you forget already? That night when we killed him? I thought Texas boys were supposed to be smart. But you're a Dr. Pepper short of a 6-pack. No law enforcement for this deal. We handle it ourselves. Bones was about to say Norby had been the one who cracked Corsica over the head with a big mag light, twice. All Bones had done was help bury the body. The look on Norby's face told him to keep his mouth shut. And we'll stop in the middle of chapter 1.
What a great beginning. I'm already sucked into the story. When Kathy's done with this book, I'm going to borrow it from the library. So to start out, can you summarize Strange Fire for us?
Sure, I'm happy to. So Strange Fire is a suspenseful and a romantically charged environmental legal thriller about fracking and drilling for natural gas. So we have a setting, we've already met Yukon Oil and Gas and some of the characters from Yukon, and they have a drill pad located in near Campbelltown in Bradford County, Pennsylvania. And the question is whether their activities have poisoned a town's drinking water supply and poisoned a neighbor's well. Now, the Department of Environmental Protection, DEP, as we all know it here in Pennsylvania, has taken the position that the only place that is up for consideration is the drilling rig itself and the drilling hole. And they've found absolutely no contamination emanating from that. So they've taken a pretty strong position that the drilling itself did not cause any contamination. But the neighbors have sued anyway. And as a result of that, Mike Jacobs, who is a DEP assistant counsel, is assigned the case. And his job is to defend the department. So he finds himself in the unique position of having to defend the department's decision that the drilling actually did not cause the contamination. After he gets involved in this case, he begins to think that perhaps the neighbors are right. Perhaps the drilling or something at the pad, in fact, did cause contamination of the water well. Now, what makes this case more interesting is that Mike works with the department's geologist, a woman named Missy Shelton, and she is convinced, and ultimately she believes very strongly, that the drilling itself didn't cause any contamination. What they begin to understand, though, is that possibly the contamination was coming from a freshwater pond that may not have been used just for fresh water. And so the two of them start looking into the department's position on this. But what makes it much more interesting also is that the lawyer who represents Yukon is from a law firm in Washington, D.C., and his name is Darius Moore. And Darius was Mike's nemesis in law school. And frankly, the two of those guys hated each other's guts. But now they're thrown together because Darius is representing Yukon and Mike's representing the department. They're on the same side. We have some other characters in the story that are worth noting. Norby LaFleur, we've just met. He's the director of operations for Yukon, a Cajun from Louisiana. We have Missy Shelton, I mentioned her. We have Teresa Bruno Campbell. And Teresa's a really interesting character. Teresa starts out as a person who's not at all politically in tune. She has no political interest whatsoever. But over time, as she realizes that her well may have been contaminated, she becomes very, very politically activated. And we see her through the arc of the story changing as she becomes goes from a person not at all interested in getting involved to somebody who's a strong political activist. And then finally, the last character I'll mention is Roger Alden. Roger is the chief of Central Region for DEP, and his job is he's the boss really for Mike, and also Mike's friend and mentor. So the story describes the investigation undertaken by DEP. It describes all the characters who are involved, and it gets into what really happened at the Campbell pad, at Yukon's Campbell pad, and we meet a number of very unusual characters, including a shady Russian who I think is very relevant to what's going on in today's world. So that's a brief summary of the story.
Excellent. And where does the title come from?
Strange fire comes from the Bible, from Leviticus. In Leviticus, it says that Nadab and Abihu brought strange fire before the Lord, and they were consumed by a burst of fire from the Lord because they brought strange fire. And what we understand strange fire to actually mean is that people can do something that they think is for a good reason, such as what Nadab and Abihu thought they were doing. But if it's not done for the right reasons, if it violates natural law, then they can still suffer severe consequences as a result of that. So it comes directly from Leviticus.
And is your book based on a real story?
Well, that's a great question. It's based on real scenarios. In a way, parts of the book are, as they say on television, ripped from the headlines. So there are times when there are vignettes and scenes in the story that come from things that may have actually happened, but there's no case that this is based on. There's no particular scenario that this is based on. My first book that I wrote, Drink to Every Beast, in fact, was based very much on a real case, and a case that occurred actually in the late 1970s. But for this one, there are realistic scenarios, things that I know potentially could have happened, things that are realistic scenes, but not things that you would be able to find if you looked it up in the newspaper. If you went to the state library and did some research, you wouldn't find anything like that. The characters also are based not on any individual, but based on the type of people that you might meet in this kind of a situation.
Why did you write this book?
Well, that's a good question. There's a kind of a longish story that goes with that, and I had always wanted to write a fracking book. When I wrote my first book that was published, Drink to Every Beast, that was based on, like I said, on a real scenario that actually did occur, the Butler mine tunnel disaster. And the Butler mine tunnel disaster took place in the late 1970s, and it involved the dumping of hazardous waste into boreholes near Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. That hazardous waste ended up in the Susquehanna River. And so that was based on sort of a hazardous waste case based on that. My next book, Amid Rage, and I see that they're now up on the screen, Amid Rage is based on a kind of, again, realistic scenarios. Again, no particular case, but realistic scenarios that could have happened in the coal mining world. And I had decided that because I had some involvement with the oil and gas industry, that I really couldn't write an oil and gas fracking book till after I retired. So I waited until I was retired to write Strange Fire. Like I said, there's no company, there's no person, there's no case that is directly from my adventures when I was involved as an environmental lawyer. But I will say that I did wait for that. And I think we're going to get into a little bit later on my physical condition, and we can talk about that too, because I also wrote the book to challenge myself. And we'll talk about that, I think, in a few minutes. But I wrote the book because it's an interesting subject. I think many people are very interested in fracking. Fracking plays a role in climate change. And I think that these are all relevant issues for our day, and something that a lot of people, I think, are very concerned about today. And it plays a role even so far as Vladimir Putin is concerned, if you can believe that. So it's a very timely subject, and I wanted to write something that was timely. Little did I know how timely it would be. If you look at the epigraph at the very beginning of the book, it was just coincidental. But right here on in the epigraph, there's an exchange between Representative Conaway and Fiona Hill. And Representative Conaway is asking her, and this takes place, by the way, during the first impeachment hearing of President Trump. And it was just one of those deals where we had it on all the time, the impeachment hearings, and I would sometimes go in and listen for a while, and then I'd get tired of it and I'd leave. I came in, I sat down, and they're talking about fracking. And it seemed as though it was a big diversion, a big footnote to what they were really talking about. But what was very interesting to me was that Conaway asks whether or not Putin is at all interested in fracking. And Fiona Hill, who, as you remember, is the great expert on Ukraine in the White House, and is still actively involved as a talking head. You see her on television all the time. Says that she was at a conference with Vladimir Putin, and in 2011, so 11 years ago, he was making it very clear, this is Hill talking, that he saw American fracking as a great threat to Russian interests. And she says, we're all struck by how much he stressed this issue, and it's since that particular junction that Putin has made a big deal of this. So little did I know when I wrote this story and when I included that quote that it would be as significant as an issue as it, I believe, currently is. But it just seemed like the right time for it, and it certainly seems as though it's even become more of the right time for it than when I thought it would be when I started writing the story several years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Perfect timing for that. Is it true that you wrote the story after you became blind?
Yes, it is, and that's what I was alluding to before. Many of you may be aware of the fact that a terrific New York Times columnist named Frank Bruni has recently come out with a book called The Beauty of Dusk. And Frank is a great writer. I love his columns. He writes for the New York Times. He's now technically left the New York Times, although he still writes for them from time to time. And he's now a professor of journalism at Duke. But he interviewed me for his book. I was not included in the book, but I was included in a large New York Times column that he wrote 3 years ago. But he and I have the same eye disease. It's called Non-Arteritic Anterior Ischemic Optic Neuropathy. And you know when you have a disease that's got a name that's this long, that's not a good thing. And what it is, basically, to try to summarize it as simply as I can, is that if you can picture the anatomy of the eyeball, behind the eyeball, there's this stringy thing that gets attached to your brain. That stringy thing is called the optic nerve. Inside that optic nerve, there might be 1 million to 2 million little nerve fibers. For some reason, I had blood clots in the back of my eyeball on the left side, and that caused the fibers, the nerve fibers in my optic nerve, to be killed off, some of them. Thankfully for me, I can still see a lot out of my left eye, but my left eye is very compromised. My vision out of my left eye, they just simply call it, when you're legally blind, they just call it 2200. They just stop counting at that point. And I was okay with that because it didn't seem to really have a huge effect on me, other than to make me nervous that it could ever happen in my right eye. And it was about a year and a half later, so in 2018, when I got it in my right eye. Same thing. There's no operation for it. There's no cure for it. It only strikes about 10,000, maybe 30,000 at the most Americans every year. It's in the category of things that they call orphan diseases. But as a result of that, it's left me legally blind. You can't tell right now, but I've got a yard-wide ultra high definition monitor in front of me. And as a result of that, I can see if I put a sentence across the page. I can read. You saw me read a little bit out of the book. If I read for more than about 15 minutes from a regular sized print on a book or a newspaper, I'll start getting some pretty bad and severe headaches. So I really can't do that for very long. Thankfully, I am able to read on a screen when it's backlit. I can read on an iPad or an iPhone. Again, after a while, it does start to bother my eyes, but I can't read many things. I can't see faces at 10 feet. But when this hit my second eye, that was in January, I realized that I was going to have to change things up quite a bit. And what I did was kind of moped around, depressed for about 2 months. I was on disability, short-term disability from my firm. And after about 2 months, I remember thinking to myself, this isn't good. I can't live like this. And I happened to have the TV on, and they were playing a sports program. And it was some skiers who were amputees, and they were skiing with one leg. Some of them were skiing with no legs. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, that's impressive that these people with one leg or even no legs are skiing. And I began to think, well, what is the equivalent of that for a writer? What's the writerly equivalent of skiing with one leg? And I thought, well, how about being blind and writing a novel? So I sat down at the beginning of March in 2018, and I started writing Strange Fire. And 7 weeks later, I was finished with the first draft. Now, I'll confess to you that when I write these days, it's much easier for me to use Dragon voice-to-text software. First of all, I was never a great typist, but it really makes my life a lot easier when I can just speak the words and it appears on the page. So yes, I wrote Strange Fire. I started it after I became legally blind, and it took a while then, once it was written, to finish up multiple drafts until it was done. And of course, that's a much more complicated process anymore than it was previously. But so I did write Strange Fire after I became blind, and I'm continuing to write. I'm writing a novel right now that tentatively is called Fire and Ice, which is a climate change novel, and that's also one where I'm writing it using Dragon voice-to-text technology. So yes, I was blind when I started writing Strange Fire.
Wow. That's so inspiring. And I love the fact that your creativity sort of came out and brought you through a rough time too. That's so neat.
Thank you. And it's, I really feel it's important. Not everybody can, can seize the moment. But I just as a message to anybody who's out there who might be disabled in some way, there are many things that you can do if you get a hold of the book that's written by Frank Bruni. He has it in Audible, as well as on hardback and on Kindle. He gives you examples of many different people who have overcome serious problems. So I just urge people who are out there who are struggling with whatever it is they're struggling with, to just make the best of it, and you'll be a much happier person if you can find something.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, back to Strange Fire. How realistic is this book?
It is very realistic. Now, it's, in a sense, when you turn on the TV and you see a cop show and they're firing guns left and right, or you turn on a doctor show and everybody who comes in has just been in a terrible car crash and they're doing neurosurgery 4 times during the show, that's just not what really happens. I mean, they may go for days and weeks on end without having to perform any neurosurgery like that, trauma neurosurgery, let alone 2 or 3 or 4 times in a single episode. And they do that, of course, because if you saw them sitting around and drinking a cup of coffee for an hour, you would say, boy, this is a boring story. I don't want to watch this. And same thing in Strange Fire and in my other books, and the same thing in, I'm going to say, virtually every other novel that you've ever read or any other program you've ever watched on TV or video or movie. And so a lot of things happen and are compressed that would normally maybe happen once in a career, once in a lifetime. There are a lot of things that, just don't really happen all that often. But and in this story, a lot of it happens, within a short time frame. So it's a very realistic story in the sense that these different episodes and events do take place, and these different things have taken place. One thing that I do, in addition to my own stories from a 40-year career as an environmental lawyer, including part of my career as an assistant attorney general for what was then called the Department of Environmental Resources, one of the things I try to do is I try to interview other environmental lawyers and to get their war stories. So I've spent a couple of hours on the phone with some of my old friends, taking down their war stories. So if you're out there and you're a former DEP or DER lawyer and you'd like to be interviewed, let me put a plug in right now. I'd be delighted to interview you, and I'd be very careful not to use your name unless you want me to. Very careful not to identify anyone who's identifiable. But so I would say that the scenarios that are in this story are very, very realistic, and in fact are the kinds of things that do happen sometimes over the course of weeks or years, but these are things that can and do happen. And even there are a lot of things that happen out in the woods, and I researched that in addition to my own love of the woods and being outdoors and seeing things myself. I also researched certain things, so I've had some questions about certain things, and let me say that before I included it in the story, I made very sure that these were things that in fact have happened and could happen.
And are the characters based on real people?
Absolutely not. I can say that with certainty. I am very careful not to base characters on anyone in particular. I will say, though, and I know that there's some writers on this program today, and I'm sure that there'll be writers watching this later on. Like anyone else, you remember some incident from your life, or a friend of yours has told you something about his or her life, and you say, boy, that's a really interesting tidbit. And I think I'm going to include that in the story. So there is what I like to say, the DNA of a number of different people who are in my stories. So, well, all of my characters are made up people. There may be some little thing about them that I've included. And a good example is Mike Jacobs. In his past, in his biography, and in the background of Mike Jacobs, we learn that he went to rabbinical school for a year. Now, after that, he decided that he wanted to study environmental science, and he goes on to study environmental science through a Bachelor of Science in Geography program at Penn State. But that little tidbit about having been in rabbinical school for a year, that's very, very loosely based on a friend of mine who went to rabbinical school for a year and ultimately became a lawyer. So I borrowed his DNA. There's nothing else about my friend other than that one tidbit in Mike Jacobs' bio. So I'm very careful about not featuring anyone. There are some names, by the way, and I will occasionally do this for friends of mine. If I have a friend or somebody who's a big supporter of mine, I will name a good character after them. And so I do that from time to time. And it's a little gift that I give to some of my friends. I've been very careful about not naming any unseemly characters after friends of mine, although I have threatened that from time to time.
So are you Mike Jacobs?
Well, let me just say this. Mike Jacobs is about the physique that I had when I was 29 years old, and the height. And my hair color, which is now pretty much white, was pretty dark at one time, dark brown. So check. He's Jewish. I'm Jewish. So check. He went to Penn State and majored in geography and got a Bachelor of Science in geography. So check. Vermont Law School, law degree, check. Worked for DEP, check. But other than that, there's nothing else similar about Mike and me. And I'll say honestly that I did that on purpose because it was easier for me to say, okay, here are some characteristics, and I know some things about this, and I don't really have to make up some of the stuff, and nobody's going to sue me because I'd have to sue myself, so that's not going to happen. So in fact, there are some additional tidbits about Mike Jacobs that are me, but again, Mike is not me. Mike's a fictional character. And so if you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, did you really do this, Joel? And the answer to that is no, I really didn't do these things. This is Mike Jacobs doing these things. And I'll give you a great example. There's at the beginning of this book, when we meet Mike, he's in the middle of a trial with a company, made up company located in South Central Pennsylvania. And Mike is in the midst of what is probably the best cross-examination of an expert witness that you'd ever expect to find. And I will say that it was, to me, sort of my dream cross-examination of an expert witness. And normally, when I would prepare for an expert witness cross-examination, I would prepare a lot. But this one was super duper prepared. And not only that, but unlike in the cross-examinations that I used to do, in this one, the witness gave exactly the right answers. So that never, ever happens in real life. In this story, it does happen. And that's because I'm trying to establish the kind of talented lawyer that Mike is. And Mike is much more talented than I ever was. But there are definitely some little tidbits that are me, but I'm going to say that other than a few little pieces of my DNA that are in Mike, for the most part, it's not me.
So are there any companies based on real companies?
No, and again, I was really careful about that. It would have been not a good thing for me to base this story on any real companies. The industry is an interesting industry. It's both homegrown in Pennsylvania, and there's also this these gigantic companies based in places like Texas and Oklahoma and Colorado and Louisiana and other places like that. But I was very careful not to base any of the companies on any real companies.
And is DEP in the book the real DEP?
Well, that's actually a great question. So thanks for asking it. The DEP in the book is not the same as our DEP. If you've read Patterson's Alex Cross books, you know that Alex is a detective in the DC Police Department. And many books have been written about the FBI, and many books have been written about the LAPD. The great writer Michael Connolly has a great character named Bosch, who's a detective in the LAPD. And there are fictitious versions of those agencies. And I would say that when you look at any writer who's written about an agency, they take the name of the agency, they take tidbits about the agency to make it realistic, but it's not the agency, it's a fictitious agency. And the same thing with my DEP. In a way, it's my way of honoring the real DEP because, like the LAPD, like the FBI, like the New York Police Department and others that have been highlighted by great writers, I'm highlighting Pennsylvania DEP. And let me also say this about Pennsylvania DEP. My experience with the department, and I've got 40 years of experience with them, more than 40 years of experience with them, including having worked there, is that there aren't enough resources, there aren't enough people, they're tasked to do something that's almost impossible. They're yelled at by people on all sides of the issue. and nobody's ever satisfied with the work that they do. And yet the people are among the most dedicated public servants I've ever met, perhaps other than the State Library of Pennsylvania. But they're very, very dedicated public servants, and they really believe in the mission of DEP. So they work very, very hard under trying circumstances, under limited resources. And I hope that all of my books ultimately end up honoring them, because that's very important to me.
I hear that. Is the science and engineering in your story real?
Now, unlike, say, the characters and unlike the companies, the science and engineering in my stories, in fact, is very real. And I worked very, very hard on that. That was very important to me. I really wanted to be sure that when you read this book, just like when you read my previous books, that you would learn something. So sadly, I've read books that, are kind of science fiction-y, but they're not real science. They may be based on tidbits of science. And what I wanted to be sure of is that I got the details of fracking correct. And I worked very, very hard on that. It was important to me to make sure that when you learned about a drill rig, or when you learned about some aspect of the drilling, or when you heard a description of how hydraulic fracturing actually takes place, that you would get an accurate depiction of what that is. And to the extent that I could, I wanted to depict it in a realistic way. So at the beginning, when you're learning about the production devices at the well pad, that's a very realistic depiction of those production trees, sometimes known as Christmas trees, by the way, by the operators. And I felt that that was important, because I really do want people to come away from my stories having learned something. And I know that there are two sides of this issue, that there are two sides of the coal mining issue in my previous book, Mid-Rage. There really aren't two sides of the issue that took place in Drink to Every Beast, which was illegal dumping of hazardous waste. But there was a lot of science that I put into that as well. So I wanted to make sure that people came away from those books having learned something, and that they would learn it in a gentle and positive way. There's a kind of thriller known as a techno thriller, and probably the one who was the greatest at that was Tom Clancy. So Tom Clancy wrote a book called The Hunt for Red October. It was a modestly successful book that sold 4.7 million copies, and they made a major motion picture featuring Sean Connery as his captain of Red October. And in that story, as you were reading it, you were learning all about Russian submarines. You were learning, or Soviet submarines actually at the time. You were learning all about American submarines. You were learning all about the technology of missiles and technology of all of the other things that are involved in that, sonar, radar, all that other stuff. And you didn't even notice that you were learning. And by the end of that, you had, if you didn't really learn anything, you at least had a strong appreciation for what was going on. And in techno thrillers, in a well-done techno thriller, you're going to learn something about what you're reading about. And that was very important to me in Strange Fire. It wasn't just enough for me to do a book and say, oh yeah, there's some stuff over there that has to do with fracking. I really wanted the readers to learn how these different people, when they're doing their jobs, what it is that they're doing and what's going on, and what's actually going on at that drill pad, what's going on under the ground. Now, one of the things I did was I tried to present the different viewpoints through different people. So there's a professor in my story, and my professor describes from a professorial perspective, some of the things going on in the geology underground. There are other characters like Norby and others who describe the drilling process, and obviously they're very pro-fracking. Then you get to characters like Teresa Bruno Campbell, a strong anti-fracking activist, and you get to there's an environmental group in my story called the Advocates, and the Advocates are anti-fracking, and you learn through those characters the other side of the issue. and I felt it was important to present the different perspectives through different characters. The other thing I didn't want to do, and I really worked very hard at this, I didn't want to preach, and that's important. So I felt as though it was important for me not to preach, and I avoided doing that as much as I possibly could. And I really tried to present both sides of the issue.
So how did you incorporate the science and engineering and drilling aspects into your story?
It's difficult to do that. Well, as in that first little bit of the chapter that I read, I'm talking about pot shots being taken at a production tree, and at the same time that you're learning about that, and you're hearing Norby and Bones talk about this man Corsica who they thought they killed. At the same time you're learning about that, and you've got this suspenseful scene going on. You're also learning something behind the scenes about the Christmas tree, or the production tree as they call it. So it was really incorporated throughout the story. And when you come to different points in the story, there's a point where Norby is taking Mike on a tour of the facility, and they're talking about where the drilling took place and how far out the laterals go. You're learning something about that while you're learning something about Norby, and you're learning something about Mike, and you're learning something about Missy and these other characters. So a lot's going on, and one of the things that's going on is my educating the readers about these various things. So it's the same, really the same kind of technique that a writer like Clancy used, in terms of not beating you over the head with it and saying, okay, class, now we're going to talk about nuclear submarines. It's talking about it in the context of the story while other action is going on.
And who are your writing influences?
Well, certainly Clancy is a big one, but I like some of the great masters of thrillers, people like Lee Child and James Patterson and others like that. I mean, anybody who writes thrillers is going to like people like that. I mean, there are others as well. I mean, John Grisham obviously is a very big influence of mine, and I do call these stories legal thrillers, although what this story focuses mostly on is the investigative part. I love other writers as well. I'm not sure that they're as much of an influence. Thomas Harris, who wrote the Hannibal Lecter stories, I just love his writing, and maybe a little bit of his writing in terms of suspense has snuck into my book. I happen to like also many non-thriller writers, and probably my favorite of all time was Philip Roth. So I really do like Philip Roth. I like people like Michael Chabon, McCarthy. So I like a lot of different writers, and they've all influenced me in one way or another.
Is there going to be another Mike Jacobs book?
Maybe. I've been writing some other things right now, and the story that I'm working on right now is not a Mike Jacobs story. I've got a different character, and it's a completely different kind of scenario. I think Mike is going to spend a little time in the waiting room or on the bench. He's had an awful lot happen to him since the first story. He's been shot at. People have tried to kill him. He's had calamities. He's had some interesting dilemmas with his lady friends, and he's lost his mother. So he's had a number of things happen to him. I think I'm going to let Mike sit it out for a few downs and just relax a bit. Mike, I actually have started another Mike Jacobs story called The Firebrand, but I think I'm just going to let that one rest a little bit before I go and finish it. I'm working on another story right now, which is sort of cli-fi, as they call it, climate fiction. And so I'm working on that right now. It does not involve Mike.
And do you have any advice for budding authors?
Yes, I do. If you're thinking about writing, the most important thing you can do is write. I know that sounds like that's simple or simplistic, but I've talked to many people over the years since my first novel came out, and they say to me, I really want to write a novel and I just don't know how to get started. And I have these ideas. And I say, well, how long have you been thinking about writing? And they'll say, oh, well, I've been thinking about writing for 10 years and I've really wanted to do, well, how much have you written? Nothing. Oh, I'm afraid to write. So the most important thing you can do is stop procrastinating, just sit down, and if you do it longhand, write longhand. If you do it on a laptop or a computer, just start typing. If you dictate it like I do, then just start dictating. The most important thing you've got to do is write. And related to that is advice that's given by Anne Lamott, who's a great writer herself and a great instructor of writing, and Stephen King, who not only is the most popular writer in America today, but is also a great instructor of writing. And both of them say, don't worry about your first draft. I won't get into exactly what they said because they are pretty strong about it, but they both say it's very important for you to just get your first draft down and don't worry about it. Don't worry about anybody else seeing it because nobody else is going to see your first draft. So you're going to write that first draft. It's going to look lousy. They use another word, and you're going to modify that and edit it and just work on that over and over until you're finally proud of it. But don't worry about your first draft. So the most important thing is just to write. And then the other thing I'm going to say, and this seems kind of logical, and that is read. I've also talked to some people who tell me that they're writing a novel, and I'll say to them, what do you like to read? And they say, oh, well, I'm really not a big reader. I mean, I don't know how you can be a writer without being a reader for several reasons. Number one, it seems a little, I don't know, disingenuous to want to be a writer unless you read. And I suppose I get that, but it would be like a person who wants to play football but doesn't like to watch football on television or live. I mean, you've got to love both the writing process itself as well as the reading process. And so the other thing too is the master class that you're going to get about writing is through reading the books. If you read somebody like Lee Child, I know a lot of people love Lee Child. I happen to love Lee Child. There's some people who don't like Lee Child at all. But if you read a Lee Child book, when you're done reading that book, or you read a Patterson book, or you read a Stephen King book, you're going to learn an awful lot about the writing process just by reading what it is that they have written. Let's say you like literary work. So if you read, somebody like a Philip Roth, or you read, Shaban, or you read, one of the other great writers, Annie Proulx, and you read all of those, right? You're going to learn an awful lot about writing just by seeing what it is that they've written. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to then go and you're going to write an Annie Proulx story. I'm not saying that you're going to sit down and try to mimic Lee Child, but you're going to learn an awful lot about their writing style, and you may incorporate a few little things that they do because you're going to say, oh, that really works. I think I'll try and do something like that in my story. And your story is going to be personal to you. And obviously you don't want to copy somebody. You don't want to be, you don't want to just be derivative of another writer. But at the same time, I think it's very important for you to do your best to read these other writers because they're going to teach you an awful lot about the writing process.
Thank you so much. That's great advice for us starting out. I remember Sandy mentioning the same sort of ideas in her Lunch and Learn that she did for the State Library a while ago, which is recorded and up on our website if you want to see Sandy's presentation, Sandy Nork. Talked about the importance of just sitting down and writing, like the actual act of sitting down and writing it rather than thinking about writing. So we have time here to answer questions from the audience. If anybody wants to put questions in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself. I think I saw one chat question come up here. There were several here. Okay, Kathy asks, some of the scenes are very violent and the language very real. What audience are you aiming for?
It's a real dilemma because I'm not writing YA, young adult literature, and I'm not writing stories for children. And I want people to get a sense of what the world is like out there. And I was very careful. If you follow along, you'll see that certain characters use a lot of four-letter words, and other characters never use them. They just would never use them. And some of that is a reflection of the type of person that they are. I'd like to say that everybody out there in the real world, speaks the King's English, and nobody would ever dare to use a four-letter word. But there's certain words that we all know and try to avoid, I think, in our common parlance. But there's certain words that do get used an awful lot in certain places. And so when you see certain characters using foul language, and by the way, that might be somebody who works at a drill site, and it also might be a trial lawyer. I mean, you take a look at what some of the trial lawyers say. Their language may be some of the foulest language of anybody. And this is based, when I was asked earlier, how realistic is my story? I tried to make the language realistic too. So I apologize to people who don't care for foul language, but it is part of what we see here. And you will see many characters, many real people, maybe not on television, certainly not on television, certainly not in polite company, but when they're out there in the field, and the field might be behind the scenes as they're getting ready for a trial, the field might be in an office somewhere using foul language. This is the kind of language that I heard for 40 years as a practicing lawyer in this area, environmental and oil and gas. So sadly, that's what you're going to see, and I try to present that because I want my stories to be as realistic as possible. But like I said, it's not limited to just the lumberjacks. It could be very much, and very often is, the politicians and the lawyers who, when the cameras aren't on, I've found sometimes have some of the foulest language of anybody.
Kathy also adds that she likes the scene at the end with the snakes, and it makes her think of Indiana Jones.
Well, I don't want to do any spoilers, but yes, the snakes, we talk about snakes all the way through the story, and thank you for that. And I did a lot of research, plus my own personal experiences from being out in the woods, but I did a lot of research. So thank you, Kathy, for that. And that shows me, by the way, that you read all the way through, and I'm glad you did. I hope you enjoyed it.
Nicole asks, why would another country find fracking in the USA a threat?
Well, keep in mind that the three countries in the world that are the largest exporters of fossil fuels are Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Russia. And as we all know, we certainly heard over and over again in the news, Russia's energy exports are really what's propping up Russia today. Mm-hmm. And the reason that Putin has taken such a strong interest, as Fiona Hill has shown us in her testimony to Congress a number of years ago now, the reason he's taken such a strong interest in it is because fracking has really unlocked a lot of natural gas. In Pennsylvania had an oil and natural gas industry that went back to 1859. When Colonel Drake drilled his first well in Titusville, Pennsylvania, I mean, he wasn't doing any fracking. Although, by the way, I've done research on this. They actually did do fracking in the 1860s.
Wow.
They used explosives back then to fracture the rock. They had a thing known as a torpedo that they would drop down the borehole, and it would explode, and it would unleash the oil or the gas. But we're not going to get into that. I will mention, by the way, in the 1970s, the government of the United States actually attempted nuclear fracking. And if you think that it was just some crazy scientist, they actually did it 4 times out in New Mexico. And they found that that by releasing a nuclear warhead underground, it ended up dissolving all of the natural gas. And it didn't unleash the gas; it actually vaporized.
Oh,
no. So Putin understands that fracking and unconventional drilling in the United States has really made the United States one of the top producers. And Pennsylvania, which was always maybe number 15 or 20 on the list in terms of gas producers, today is number 2. Pennsylvania is just, I think if I remember correctly, I just read this, 23% of the natural gas in the United States today that's being drilled is coming from Texas, and 21% is coming from Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania really is the #2 natural gas producer. We're not a big oil producer. We don't have that much oil underground in Pennsylvania, but it's become a very large natural gas producer.
Yeah, I worry with the whole situation with Russia. If there's going to be a movement to frack more and drill more, and I'm an avid camper and hiker, and going through Moshannon State Forest and seeing all those well pads every quarter mile is just so upsetting. But
Well, in my opinion, what I would like to see is in as short a term as possible, because climate change is a very real thing. In as short a term as possible, I would like to see us get away from all carbon-based fuels if we can. And that would also completely diminish the power that Russia has, or that Middle Eastern countries have, over the world and over the United States. If we could do that, if we got to renewables, if we really did some serious conservation. So I'd like to see us do that. I think in the short run, though, we're going to be seeing a lot of pressure to do more fracking and to make up the difference, because right now since January, we're the #1 exporter of LNG, liquefied natural gas, in the world. And we're always right up there as #2 or #3, but currently we're the #1 exporter. So I suspect that for at least the short run, we will continue to be a big producer of natural gas and oil.
Yeah. Nicole added, if something doesn't work the first time, I guess you have to try 3 more times.
I'm trying to remember the name. It had a funny name. The project was called Gas Buggy, Project Gas Buggy. And this is some of the older people on this program may remember that there was a program in the 60s and 70s for what they called the peaceful use of nukes. And this was part of that peaceful use of nukes. But it really didn't work at all. It worked very badly. But again, they did it 4 times. So I found it so fascinating. I researched it a number of years ago and just was astonished. You look it up. Just nuclear fracking is all you have to Google, and you'll find it.
Kathy also added that you could do another book on wind power.
I could. My brother would like that. My brother happens to be the executive director of one of the wind power associations. That'll take some effort, though, to try and do that. There is a story there, and that is that certain energy interests work very, very hard against wind and solar power, and that could be a story. That would be an interesting story, I think.
Yeah, Kathy added the link in for the gas buggy site.
Project Gas Buggy.
Yeah,
it really happened. It wasn't just me making it up.
We will be reading about that right after this program ends. Thank you so much, Mr. Burcat, for participating in our Lunch and Learn program. We are recording this, so we will have it up on our website after PDE processes the video, turns it into a YouTube. And we're also sending this to Mr. Burcat, so check out his website. He might have it sooner than PDE posts it. And thank you all for joining us today. If you have any questions, there was contact information for Joel on the slides, which we can also add into the chat here.
Well, thank you very much. This has been great. It's been a lot of fun. I'm so honored that my books are in the state library, and so I really appreciate that. And they're also available on Amazon or Midtown Scholar, all the usual places. So I hope this has been enlightening for everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Ellen.